Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sara Spinks.
Welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations. Safeguarding practice is continually evolving, particularly as we learn from inquiries following serious incidents. Phase 1 of the Southport Inquiry has just been published, detailing important insight into how agencies identified, assessed and responded to escalating risk prior to the tragic attack of the 29th of July 2024. Now, just for clarity, in the UK, a national inquiry, commonly known as a public inquiry, is an independent investigation ordered by a government minister to examine events of significant public concern. And this usually follows things like major scandals, failures of service, or disasters. Established under the Inquiries Act 25, these inquiries exist to establish facts, determine accountability, and make recommendations to prevent reoccurrence.
And I think, Sam, it's important to say the attack in Southport resulted, in the tragic murders of 3 little girls and left the UK really grappling, with profound questions about how society identifies and prevents acts of extreme violence. Something, we've actually discussed in our Is Prevent Fit for Purpose podcast, which listeners, you can access that from our back catalogue.
And as with previous national inquiries, phase 1 findings do not simply relate to one individual case. They highlight broader systemic themes. So Sara, we've both read the report. Maybe you could just set the context of the inquiry?
Yes, well, the Southport Inquiry examined the circumstances leading up to the attack and considered whether opportunities existed for earlier intervention. And evidence presented to the inquiry identified multiple points at which concerns were known to services, but where risk was not fully understood or not sufficiently shared and not acted upon in a coordinated way.
It also identified uncertainty about which agency held lead responsibility for understanding and managing risk. Where several services were involved, concerns were often considered within individual professional contexts, but not always brought together to form a shared understanding of that cumulative risk. And this highlights the importance of clarity around professional roles and responsibilities when cases involve multiple agencies.
Yeah, and I think, as regular listeners will know, Sam, we've had many discussions about agency ownership of risk. That, that it's needed to retain ownership of the concern until the most appropriate agency or agencies accept referral.
Absolutely, Sara. I mean, I've lost count of the number of times I've said this. There needs to be a model where if a referral is not appropriate for one agency, they hold responsibility until an alternative agency or agencies accepts the referral, basically to avoid gaps and safeguarding failures. And as this latest report shows, this really needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and the findings they particularly highlighted, so I'm going to give a list really: fragmented information held across agencies, missed opportunities for early intervention, lack of clear ownership of risk, challenges in recognising patterns of escalating concern, limitations in existing risk management approaches, and the importance of joined up multi-agency working.
So let's look at the key themes that have emerged. The first theme, patterns of concern were present but not fully connected. So one of the strongest messages from the inquiry is that no single concern alone appeared sufficient to trigger decisive intervention. but when viewed cumulatively, the level of risk was more significant.
And this reflects a common safeguarding challenge. Concerns may appear low level or ambiguous when considered individually, but become more serious when they're viewed chronologically, they're shared across agencies, they're understood within wider contextual safeguarding frameworks,
Yeah.
and considered alongside behaviour patterns, and then linked to emerging vulnerabilities.
Sarah, in my opinion, it's absolutely staggering that this is still problematic across agencies because it's such a fundamental part of safeguarding, everyday safeguarding practice, building that picture of concern where small, perhaps seemingly unrelated concerns, when they're viewed collectively, they present a much more worrying picture.
I know, Sam, and the findings reinforce the key principles of our training, the importance of maintaining clear and accurate safeguarding chronologies,
Yeah, absolutely.
recognizing patterns over time, ensuring information is not viewed in isolation, understanding that repeated low level concerns may indicate escalating risk, and this aligns closely with increasing emphasis on chronologies in safeguarding practice, an area which many DSLs are strengthening as part of monitoring and quality assurance.
Yeah. So the second theme is the importance of professional curiosity. So the inquiry highlights the need for professionals to remain professionally curious, particularly where behaviours or presentations raise questions but do not initially meet statutory thresholds. Now, Sarah, we talk a lot about the importance of professional curiosity, so it might just be worth clarifying what we mean.
Well, professional curiosity involves asking appropriate questions, seeking context rather than accepting surface explanations, considering underlying needs or vulnerabilities, and remaining open to the possibility that risk may be greater than initially presented, and then revisiting early assumptions when new information emerges. And I think in education settings, professional curiosity may be relevant where behavior changes over time or concerns are reported but appear inconsistent. A child that presents differently across contexts and concerns that are raised by multiple sources and that information that feels incomplete or unclear.
Yeah, so the findings, they reinforce that safeguarding decisions should not rely solely on whether a single incident meets a specific threshold, but whether the overall picture suggests increasing vulnerability or risk. And relating back to theme one, that picture needs to be maintained across agencies. And that brings us to theme three. Information sharing across agencies remains critical.
Yeah, and this key theme highlights the importance of effective multi-agency communication.
Yeah.
And the inquiry, highlights challenges where information was held by different services or not fully shared but not fully understood, not combined into a coherent risk picture and not escalated appropriately.
It also highlighted the risk that agencies may assume another service is taking the lead in managing concerns. And where responsibility is unclear, opportunities to bring information together and assess cumulative risk may be missed. And this reinforces the importance of clarity about roles, escalation pathways, and professional challenge where concerns persist.
And educational settings play an important role in safeguarding partnership and often hold valuable contextual information that relates, behavior patterns, peer relationships, online activity concerns, for example, attendance patterns, changes in presentation or family context, and then that sort of previous safeguarding history.
I mean, they really do, Sarah. When you think about it, of all the agencies, schools, any educational system, they are actually having the most exposure to frequent contact than any other agency.
Yeah.
So they hold, you're absolutely right, a huge amount of valuable contextual information, not just about what's happening in school, because there's so much information that they actually gather just from knowing young people, children, knowing the families around
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
So, Working Together to Safeguard Children 2026, which it's been updated, it emphasises a strengthened multi-agency approach through the evolving family help model, which aims to reduce fragmentation between early intervention and statutory services.
And then obviously schools remain key partners within this system and should feel confident in sharing concerns appropriately and contributing to multi-agency discussions, then escalating concerns where necessary, ensuring that safeguarding information is recorded clearly and maintaining secure and accurate records.
And this brings us to theme 4, which is early help, family help, and escalation pathways. So the inquiry highlights the complexity of decision making where needs do not clearly sit at one threshold level. And this reflects national developments in safeguarding practice, particularly the move toward family help, as described in Working Together 2026. So the intention of the family help approach, it's very, very similar to early help. And I think, at the moment, we will still use that term early help and we'll be doing early help assessments and things in schools. But I think as we progress, that will very quickly become family help. The intention of that family help approach is to reduce fragmentation between services, support earlier identification of need, improve continuity of support for families, strengthen multidisciplinary working, and ensure that risk is not overlooked due to those threshold boundaries.
I think for schools, this reinforces the importance of really understanding local thresholds and engaging in that early support pathways. And that, by recognizing when support needs to be escalated, documenting those concerns clearly, and maintaining that oversight of ongoing support plans. So I think DSL should ensure staff understand that safeguarding is not limited to crisis response, but includes identifying emerging concerns early. And that's definitely something when I was ahead that we used early help effectively for, really.
And I think as well, I was really struck by the first thing you mentioned, understanding local thresholds, because I actually think it would be highly unlikely for, I would say, the vast majority of staff working in schools really wouldn't have any idea about the thresholds, say, for instance, that social care
Yeah,
operate under.
definitely.
And I know I have heard in practice, I have heard staff being very frustrated because to them there are real concerns, but because they don't, and they don't understand why social care are not going to engage. And that's really down to not understanding the
Yeah,
thresholds
definitely.
that, and there's certain language and certain terminology that will increase a case. It will sort of move up the threshold. So I think there's a lot of work to be done as in this whole theme. I think it's very aspirational, but I still think there's not enough in here that is actually going to make a big impact on the actual multi-agency working on the ground. For instance, in this case, as I've just described, who's going to do the piece of work with schools about understanding social care thresholds?
Yeah, yeah,
And that
definitely.
will be exactly the same, linking with all the agencies, with CAMS or whoever. I think there's a big piece of work to be done there.
Definitely.
So moving on, theme 5 looks at behaviour as a safeguarding consideration. So the findings highlight the importance of recognising behaviour as a potential indicator of underlying need or vulnerability. Now, this is something which really needs accurate tracking to avoid concerns being lost. And it's important to distinguish between behaviour as a conduct or disciplinary matter, behaviour as a possible indicator of safeguarding need, behaviour that, may signal contextual risk factors, behaviour, say, linked to mental health or vulnerability, or behaviour that may suggest exposure to harmful influences. So I think my key message here is when you're looking at and thinking about a behavioural, it's a consideration, and it should be also a safeguarding consideration. It's not necessarily, if something is going on with behaviour, it is not necessarily a safeguarding issue, but it should be a safeguarding consideration.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for educational professionals, they're often best placed to identify patterns over time and
Yeah,
consider whether behavior may indicate, things like distress or unmet need or
yeah,
social isolation or exposure to harmful content, the exploitation risk, emotional or psychological difficulty, emerging radicalization concerns, or online harms or harmful influences.
absolutely. And this reflects the importance, doesn't it, of maintaining that whole child perspective rather than viewing the behaviour purely through a disciplinary lens.
Yeah, and the inquiry also highlighted the importance of ensuring that identified needs or diagnoses, including neurodivergence or SEND, do not reduce professional curiosity. Understanding vulnerability should support fuller assessment of risk rather than providing reassurance that concerns are less significant.
Absolutely. It should, as you say, Sarah, it should actually have the opposite
Yeah,
effect. It should
yeah.
actually be, there should be
It's
even
not an
more.
excuse.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, and there should be even more professional curiosity because it
yeah,
is more difficult to
yeah,
determine what is
yeah,
going on.
yeah.
I totally agree with that one. So, theme 6 of the report focuses on online activity as part of the wider safeguarding picture.
Yeah, and the inquiry also identified online behaviour as part of the wider context of concern. Interest in harmful or violent material formed part of the cumulative work picture, but didn't always result in a coordinated safeguarding response.
I mean, online experiences, they form a huge part of children and young people's everyday lives, influencing how they understand identity, relationships, and the world around them. Exposure to harmful or extreme content may sit alongside other indicators of vulnerability. And so that must be considered within the wider safeguarding context.
And I think this reinforces the importance of understanding online behaviour as part of the whole child safeguarding picture,
Absolutely.
rather than viewing online risks solely through filtering or monitoring systems.
Absolutely. And we need to stop thinking about it as something, separate.
Yeah.
It's something that's partly one of the dangers, isn't it? That if we start to think about online safety, we're actually sort of putting a label on it and it sits very separate in a separate box over there. But it is such an intrinsic part of children and young people's lives.
Oh,
It isn't,
definitely.
it isn't separate.
Yeah.
So the final theme, number 7, looks at safeguarding culture and leadership. So the inquiry reinforces the importance of a strong safeguarding culture within organisations and states that effective safeguarding cultures should be characterised by clear expectations, open communication, shared responsibility, appropriate challenge, supportive supervision, strong leadership oversight, effective training, and robust monitoring and review processes, all of which, there's nothing new in there.
No, nothing new. And of course, school leaders and governors play a really important role in ensuring that safeguarding systems are, understood by all staff. They're consistently applied and regularly reviewed and aligned with statutory guidance, but then also responsive to emerging risks. And I think this includes ensuring that safeguarding policies reflect, those sort of current national developments,
Yeah.
including working together to safeguard children 2026, developments in online safety legislation and prevent duty updates, that increasing awareness of technology assisted harm, and as well as multi-agency partnership expectations.
So with these key themes in mind, Sarah, let's look at the implications for educational settings. So the Southport Inquiry reinforces several practical considerations for schools and colleges. And this includes reviewing safeguarding chronologies. And I'm really going to flag the importance of chronology tracking here. It's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
For
It's the jigsaw, isn't it? It's the jigsaw of pieces. Yeah.
Well, the thing about it is, and we're going off a little bit of tangent here, but when you are talking about safeguarding, say for instance, in a school, you are talking about safeguarding from three different perspectives. The one we're all the most familiar with, which is safeguarding the child or, the children and young people, safeguarding staff, and then safeguarding the organisation, the school itself. And I have to say, having been involved in, when things have gone very wrong, sitting on the opposite seat where I'm actually looking at where it all went wrong, one of the first things I will do is I go to governance and I start there, and I want a safeguarding chronology. And I work from the chronology and I think out, well, who was doing what when?
Yeah.
And what, so you knew that at that point. What did you put in place?
So what? Yeah.
What did you put in place? I really can't emphasize enough how important having a robust safeguarding chronology is. And it was one of the key parts that we put a lot of time and consideration into when we developed the safeguarding concern, our tracker. So definitely that's one that's really, a really huge, important part of practice. Also, insurance systems allow patterns to be identified over time rather than viewing incidents in isolation. Again, I'm just going to come back to if you have a system and you're tracking, safeguarding incidents and concerns that are being reported, they should be linked. There should be some way of knowing that there have been previous concerns, that it's not just a case of logging a concern and then you see that concern. There must be something to prompt that there have been previous concerns. And I would say that's particularly important in secondary settings where children are
Being seen by multiple people, aren't they?
Multiple people, multiple times.
Yeah.
The exposure is lower, so they don't have the benefits, say, that colleagues working in primary settings do, where they are spending a lot of time with the children. So that is really, really crucial that, say, for instance, something happened in my class in the afternoon, I log it onto the system. Somebody looking at that would be looking and saying, oh, that's an incident. Oh, but hold on a minute, there were two other incidents that day, which the person who's reported in the afternoon may know nothing about.
Yeah.
And so it's so important to link all these things together. Then you can see the patterns. Then, as we talked about earlier, that picture develops. It becomes much, much clearer. And that also ties into the next point, which is it helps to strengthen the professional curiosity. It just makes you think, oh, hold on a minute, this is a little bit more of a worrying picture here. What are we actually looking at? Also, encourage staff to explore concerns, but appropriately. They're not investigating, but they should know to seek advice when they're unsure. And I always say, if in doubt, report to your DSL. Ensuring clear recording practices and accurate recording, it supports effective information sharing and the risk assessment that follows.
And there's also things like, maintaining strong DSL oversight. DSL should regularly review safeguarding information holistically.
Yes.
And then promoting that effective multi-agency working, that's sort of engaging constructively with partners and contributing to joined up safeguarding responses. Always reviewing your training content. Safeguarding is constantly evolving. And it is why we update our training on an ongoing basis. We're constantly doing that. It's not just once a year. Yes, statutorily, once a year you have to do it, but it isn't. It's much more as things feed in and learning happens throughout that year. Staff training, it's got to reflect that emerging risks. And that includes online harms, and contextual safeguarding considerations. And then, supporting that strong safeguarding culture. And finally, creating, I think, an environment where the staff really feel confident raising concerns and seeking advice. It has to be an open door for that.
Absolutely. I mean, the Southport Inquiry, it provides a sobering reminder that safeguarding practice relies on collective vigilance, effective communication, and professional curiosity. And while no single professional holds the full picture, each agency plays an important role in identifying, sharing, I'll just repeat that, and responding to concerns.
Yeah, and the report, also highlights the importance of ensuring that responsibility for understanding risks does not become unclear when several agencies are involved.
Yeah.
Effective safeguarding, it does require both shared responsibility and clarity about coordination.
As these frameworks continue to evolve, ongoing reflection and learning from these national inquiries, they remain essential in strengthening our practice and improving outcomes for children and young people. And it was interesting, yesterday I saw something that was written by somebody who'd reviewed the Southport document, and they were quite frustrated at highlighting, the same things again, not sharing information, multi-agencies not working effectively together. And it was questioning the point of having these inquiries. But what I would just say is, they're incredibly useful tools for changing and developing practice. I mean, we would not have a vetting service, we wouldn't have had what were CRB, now DBS checks. That came as a result of a national inquiry, the Soam case. So there is a lot of change and legislative and practice change, but the one thing that we really do need to focus on is multi-agency working, because that is remaining problematic. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please like and follow. And if you can, you can find our back catalogue. It's on the website, and you can access all our previous podcasts in the series from your podcast provider. Thanks for listening.